I'm Ken Germany, a professor of history here at the University of South Carolina, sitting in for Mark Smith. You may notice a slight difference in my voice from Professor Smith. We are here today to talk politics and our take on the South and a whole lot of other things with David Masciotra. A few bits about Professor Masciotra. He is the author of I Am Somebody, Why Jesse Jackson Matters. He's also the author of Mellencamp, American Troubadour, also the author of Barack Obama, Invisible Man, and is one of the world's experts on Metallica. So we have a lot to talk about. In addition, is someone that writes about Bruce Springsteen and Bruce Springsteen's progressive political vision. Professor Masciotra is a graduate of Valparaiso University and the University of St. Francis. He also teaches literature and political science at the University of St. Francis and Indiana University Northwest. Welcome to the University of South Carolina and the Institute of Southern Studies studios. David Masciotra.
Thank you very much for having me. I've been looking forward to it.
Well, great. So mostly we'll talk today about Jesse Jackson.
Not Metallica?
I'm sure there are some comparisons that we could make in terms of electrifying an arena.
Very good, yeah.
And I guess you could have a relief pitcher for the New York Yankees walk into Jesse Jackson, a Jesse Jackson speech, and that would probably work pretty well too. So as we think about where we are today, and we're in the 2020s, and Jesse Jackson is in his 80s, and so he has lived an American life. And I wonder if we could pull back to 2008 in the aftermath of Barack Obama's election in Chicago, and the cameras caught Jesse Jackson with tears running down his face.
Yeah. That's a great moment to reflect upon. And when I asked Jesse Jackson about it, he said that he cried tears of joy for the moment, because it was certainly something to celebrate. And then he cried tears of sadness for the movement, because of all of the people who he felt deserved to be there to celebrate alongside him. Everyone from Dr. Martin Luther King to Medgar Evers, to so many of the civil rights heroes. But who couldn't be there to witness that moment that didn't usher us into a post-racial utopia, but was certainly a significant marker of progress and a significant marker of the revolutionary triumph of the civil rights movement. And what's interesting about the connection with Reverend Jesse Jackson to the candidacy and eventual presidency of Barack Obama is that the vision and the mission that Jackson articulated and exercised in his own presidential campaigns in 1984 and 1988, which was to build a rainbow coalition, to use his terminology, of races, voters of all races, gay and straight voters, young and old voters, and voters across class lines. He had famously said, if we leave the racial battleground to find economic common ground, we can reach for moral higher ground. That was the coalition that made the Obama victory possible. When Jackson first articulated that message, it wasn't nearly as well received by the leadership of the party, not to mention the mainstream press and the broader political culture, but it had become mainstream at least rhetorically, in Democratic Party politics by then, and Obama was a perfect symbol and executor of it. One more interesting fact that is rarely, if ever, discussed about that connection is when Jackson ran for president in 1984, most people predicted it would be a footnote, that he would end with 1 or 2% of the vote, across the nationwide primary competition. He actually finished with 19% of the vote, so almost 1 out of every 5 Democratic voters supported him. But he received a very, very small amount of delegates who would put his name in for the nomination, because in 1984, the Democrats had a winner-take-all system. So if you and I are running against each other in the South Carolina primary and you win 51% of the votes, you get 100% of the delegates. I get 0. He and his organization, Jackson and his organization, fought and advocated and lobbied, eventually with success, to convince the Democratic Party to switch to a proportional delegate allocation system. The significance of that is when Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton squared off in what was the closest primary in Democratic Party history, Hillary Clinton won most of the large and most populous states like New York and Pennsylvania and California, whereas Barack Obama was able to put his victory together with mostly small states. But because of that proportional delegation allocation, he was still able to get delegates in states like New York and Pennsylvania and California. And it was only for that reason that he became the Democratic Party nominee and the president. So Jackson often says, you plant seeds and trees grow, and you don't know who will enjoy the shade of those trees. And that's true in a pretty powerful way with President Barack Obama.
So we think about the relationship that Jesse Jackson had with Barack Obama. There was a hot mic moment in the early campaign. How did their relationship evolve?
Well, it really fractured the relationship. Jackson, there's a woman in Chicago named Hermine Hartman who I interviewed for my book, and she's a longtime Chicago journalist and activist. And she introduced Barack Obama to Jesse Jackson when, or shortly after, Obama lost a race for Congress in Illinois, in the Chicago area. And she thought, this is something that's very difficult for people to comprehend now, but she thought that Barack Obama needed assistance with his oratory because he had a very professorial manner of speaking. And we can still hear that professorial side of him, but it was much drier than the Barack Obama that most of us know and associate with so much charisma. So she introduced him to Jesse Jackson, and Jesse Jackson kind of gave him a public speaking clinic and allowed him to speak at Saturday morning sessions for his organization, Rainbow Push Coalition in Chicago. So they had a good relationship. His daughter, Santita Jackson, was a bridesmaid in the Obama wedding. But after Jackson made that remark, Obama really distanced himself from Jackson and never once invited him to the White House, and came to embrace and anoint Al Sharpton as the successor to Jackson as a civil rights leader with a national profile. I would, of course, argue that was a mistake, but I wasn't the president of the United States. I wasn't calling those shots. So if you talk to President Obama, let him know I found that erroneous. But that's what happened with the relationship. So that hot mic moment was very damaging.
Thinking about Jackson's contributions to American politics, to American life, and specifically to the Democratic Party, what would you lay out as like maybe the two top contributions that Jackson made? One of them you mentioned is the Obama coalition that's very linked to a coalition that Jesse Jackson had been developing for decades. I know it's impossible to do this in like a quick list, but what might be the two that stick out to you?
Well, the first one, I'll expand and elaborate on that coalition. Robert F. Kennedy, when he ran for president, and one can find out in your colleague Patricia Sullivan's book, Justice Rising, sought to coalesce all kinds of different constituencies. And no one had really picked up that mantle until Jackson ran in 84 and 88. And Jackson was the first candidate, for example, to make gay rights a central part of his campaign. He slept nights in hospices alongside people dying of AIDS. and he had openly gay campaign workers, introduce him at events. It was the first time anyone had done that. He won a large share of white farmers in states like Missouri and Iowa. He did bilingual events to Latino audiences, and he appeared on Native American reservations and did events there. He was also, according to Butch Wang, a longtime Chinese American activist in California, he was the first candidate to accept invitations from Chinese immigrant and Chinese American organizations to go there and speak directly to them. So now, one of the buzzwords, and I don't mean that disparagingly, in academia and left of center politics is intersectional. The Jackson campaigns were, in some ways, the first, and in some ways still the most powerful example of intersectional politics. And now it's impossible to imagine a Democrat winning at a national level without an intersectional rainbow coalition. So that would be one that I would say. Second, Jackson was a very large part of the movement to increase black power and black leadership at the local and municipal level. So there was a meeting in
borrowing on his civil rights, grassroots organizing.
Yes, so there was a pivotal meeting in Gary, Indiana, after Richard Hatch became a mayor of Gary, and he was the first black mayor of what was then considered a major city. Unfortunately, Gary's no longer considered a major city. And Jackson and Hatch and Andrew Young, former aide to Dr. King, and several others really developed a strategy for getting more black mayors elected, eventually black governors, black officials elected from everything from city council to Congress. And some of that work really culminated in dramatic fashion with the election of Harold Washington to mayor of Chicago in the 1980s. And it was the election of Harold Washington to mayor of Chicago in the 1980s that attracted Obama to move to Chicago and become a political organizer there. And then out of the Jackson presidential campaigns, because of his ushering of so many 6 million new voters into the party, many of them black, you had the election of David Dinkins in New York, Governor Wilder of Virginia, the first black governor of the state, and black mayors, forgive me for forgetting their names, but black mayors of Memphis and Charlotte and Milwaukee and many other major cities. So I would say that those are the two, just off the top of my head, critical achievements of Jackson's life and legacy within the Democratic Party. The establishment of a rainbow coalition across the electorate, and then also the acceleration of black power and leadership at the local and state level.
So we've talked about Chicago, and I don't have a lot of conversations during the week where Chicago comes up as often as it has in the last 10 minutes. But if you're talking about modern American politics, do you think Chicago is the center? I mean, in terms of the divisions, the dilemmas that are there, the dilemmas with race, the intersectional politics that you talked about. Definitely Chicago is put up today as a place of violence and a place, that is a place of doom and the worst things in America, or at least some versions of it. And I'm wondering, where do you situate Chicago in this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, Chicago has become a stalking horse for the Republican Party and the American right because of the gun violence problem that certainly does exist there. I mean, there's no denying it. That's not an invention. And it's gotten worse in the past couple of years, as it has in many cities. But if one looks at the history of Chicago, it is consistently at the center of some major political developments in the United States. If you think back to the '68 convention, and kind of when the anti-war movement and the increasingly activist left really began to split with the Democratic Party in some crucial ways. Chicago also, one has to remember when Dr. King went there to Chicago, he started in Chicago the movement for housing justice and the movement against predatory discrimination.
How well
in
was he
housing.
received there?
That's what I was going to say. So Dr. King said that he had never seen racism as vicious and hostile in the South as he experienced in Chicago. And when I asked Jackson about that remark, without any hesitation, he agreed with it. I mean, he said that gunshots were going off in the air and people were throwing bricks at them. And I mean, they didn't think they would make it out alive. And they had a second march planned in Cicero, a suburb right outside of Chicago, and it's the only time they canceled a march because they were met with so much hostility in Chicago. And Chicago also can symbolize how much, not to say that the party is perfect, and it's not to say that the party still doesn't need some improvement, but how much the Democratic Party has changed. I mean, Richard Daley, as the mayor of Chicago, infamously gave a shoot-to-kill order against protesters outside the Democratic Convention. He was a real enemy of the civil rights movement, of the economic justice movement, whereas now Chicago has a mayor named Lori Lightfoot. She's a black, openly gay woman, and there are certainly some problems with her mayoral leadership, but she showcases an entirely different set of values and priorities than what one could have seen with Daley. So Chicago can also act as a great symbol of this soft, quiet revolution that occurred in American politics and the Democratic Party due to the successes of the civil rights movement.
So Jesse Jackson spent so much of his career building a coalition of people from a broad range of backgrounds and saw himself as a unifier. Why has the Jesse Jackson vision of a rainbow coalition seemingly become such a divisive thing in American life today?
Yeah, well, I mean, that came from his years with Dr. King, and on Dr. King's last birthday, he convened a meeting of Jewish activists from New York and white activists from the Appalachian Mountains and Latino activists from the Southwest and Native American activists from various reservations to discuss poverty and ways to combat it. So Jackson attempted to exercise that same method of politics. It's become divisive. I mean, there's certain phrases that we now use, well, not we, but certain people in our discourse, identity politics and woke. It's become divisive, I would argue, because of its triumphs. I mean, there are certain factions of our society, certain factions in our politics, namely the Republican Party, who resent those successes, and they can see the country changing around them, and they can sense accurately that it makes them politically vulnerable. So therefore, there's an attempt to twist it into something that is threatening to the white majority. That if blacks gain and Latinos gain and Asians gain, it's a threat to whites. If secular people gain and LGBTQ people gain, then it's a threat to Christians of more traditional values. If young women make gains, it's a threat to men. And obviously that brand of politics has a long history in our country. One can go back even further, but I'm thinking of Richard Nixon's Southern strategy. I'm thinking of Ronald Reagan, opening his 1980 campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi, where 3 civil rights workers were slain, and Reagan talked about the importance of states' rights in that speech, and those civil rights workers were there to fight a certain iteration of states' rights. And then, Donald Trump, enough said. So it's and this is something Jackson argues as well, that it's a tactic born out of desperation, but unfortunately, the electorate being what it is and living in a closely divided country, it can often bear electoral fruit.
So thinking about identity politics, I'm thinking about Jesse Jackson's identity. And so we're in Columbia, South Carolina. Jesse Jackson's from Greenville, South Carolina, a son of the state who is going to leave the state. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about his life growing up, and what helps make Jesse Jackson Jesse Jackson, particularly in that Jim Crow era where he's growing up in South Carolina, which was a clearly racially segregated state.
Yeah, I mean, growing up in Greenville, South Carolina, much of his childhood to a single mother, Helen Jackson, who I had the good fortune of meeting once shortly before she died.
Oh, that's wonderful. What can you say? Tell us about
Well,
her.
she was pretty ill. She was in a hospital bed, and it was a pretty profoundly touching moment. I was there as a journalist. I hadn't quite gotten to know Jesse Jackson that well at that point, but she took my hand and she said, "Thank you for being a friend to my son." Oh. And it was just this, beautiful human moment. And it was a great reminder that, these names that we can see in history books or newspaper headlines, they're not just symbols, they're not just figures, as we use the word, but they're real human beings. And I got to, before I exited the room to give them their privacy, I got to just witness a man and his sick mother and see the love shared between them. But he talked about how he learned much of his sense of what he called Christian social work from her, that she was a beautician by trade, but she would cut and style ladies' hair for free if they had a job interview or they had a big date on a Friday night. And there was a World War I veteran who lived down the block who was illiterate, and she would help him fill out any forms or, understand any information he needed to understand. So he said that his sense of abiding compassion came from her. And there was it was a house of love with his grandmother living there as well. But of course, outside of that house, you had oppression and state-sponsored terror, and there was a rumor that a black man who was teaching black folks who were illiterate, like their neighbor, how to read, was lynched. He had just gone missing, and there was a rumor that if not lynched, he was at least murdered. And the first time that he was arrested, he was a sophomore in college at home on break. He had been attending North Carolina A&T, and he went to the black library, and he needed to check out a book for a paper he was writing, and it was out. And the librarian said, "Well, I know they have more copies at the white library, and I'm friends with the librarian who's working there right now, and she's more open-minded, and I think she'll let you in and give you the book, but I'll call her in advance to let her know to get the book ready so you don't have to browse." And he had the bad luck, or perhaps long-term the good luck, of walking into the library to get a book at a moment that a police officer happened to be in the library, and that police officer just grabbed him, manhandled him out the door, and threw him down on the curb. And the first time Jackson told me this story, even though it had 50 or 60 years had passed, he had tears in his eyes, and it's something to think about, the brazen denial and violation of one's humanity. But that was his entrance into the civil rights movement, that he decided he was going to use whatever intelligence and talents he had to marshal to fight this systemic and cultural and political and economic injustice. And he talked with his college president, a man named Samuel Proctor, who became a mentor to him. And Proctor advised him and another group of black students who lived near Greenville to stage an act of civil disobedience, to go into the library and try to check out books, which they did, and the police came, and they ran out. And Jackson called up Samuel Proctor and said, "We had to leave. They were going to arrest us." And Samuel Proctor said, "Well, that's the point. you got to go back and get arrested, because that's how you get the headline, and that's how you, more importantly, spotlight the injustice of the law and the injustice of what they're doing. So growing up in the South really shaped him, because it gave him a sense of the oppression and the persecution that he wanted to fight. And then when he moved to Chicago, he had to make certain adjustments and adapt to an equally virulent and vicious form of racism that existed there, but a racism that was far different in practice. It wasn't entirely black and white, no pun intended. It wasn't absolutes. You can use this drinking fountain, you can use that drinking fountain. It was more subtle, and therefore in some ways more insidious.
So thinking about Greenville, I wonder if you could set up who Jesse Jackson was there. So I'm thinking of him, Jesse Jackson being in a library, like physically. I mean, what did he look like? What kind of, he was an athlete. It was a crucial part of his identity in his early years.
Jackson is an imposing guy. He's 6'4", pretty broad-shouldered, always played football and baseball.
So very Southern in that regard.
Yeah, and in fact, he was a great quarterback in high school in Greenville, and he won a scholarship to play football at the University of Illinois in Champaign. But when he got there, the coaching staff almost on day one told him, "Well, you can't play quarterback here." So they started suggesting alternatives to him, that he could perhaps be a tight end or a fullback or even a defensive end. And he was treated poorly, and namely he wasn't able to play the position at which he excelled. And it's, of course, interesting to talk about that now, given that we just watched a Super Bowl that had two black starting quarterbacks, and if they aren't the two best in the league, they're in the top 5. So that's another one of those things that perhaps some of the students take for granted, black quarterbacks. But the quarterback was...
This is yet another Jesse Jackson legacy.
But quarterbacks were seen as a leadership position, and the racism of the United States viewed black people as incapable of acting as leaders. So Jackson transferred to an HBCU, North Carolina A&T, as I said earlier, and he played quarterback there, and he's in the college's Athletic Hall of Fame, and he's also in the North Carolina Athletic Hall of Fame. And he was also a great baseball player. He was offered a minor league contract upon graduating high school or college, and I don't remember which team, but it was one of the Southern farm teams. And he turned that down because he wanted to go into civil rights. But that's what Jackson would have looked like in that library. And on North Carolina's A&T campus, there's an interesting story, and it's an interesting story to reflect upon, because it makes one wonder, are leaders born or made, or is it a combination of both? Yes, he was the quarterback, but word was circulating campus that that a group of 3 or 4 black women students were arrested wrongfully, and they were being held in jail overnight, seemingly without charges. And Jackson, without much of a plan, said, we have to march to the jailhouse, and we have to, protest until they're freed. And he started marching. He led the football team to march across campus, and people started leaving class and leaving dorms just to follow them. And some of them didn't even know where they were going. And when they got there, Jackson used a bullhorn to give a speech, speaking entirely extemporaneously. And a college newspaper reporter who was part of the march said, wow, that was an amazing speech. Can I have a copy of it? And he said, I don't even really know what I said. I don't have any notes. It was just all off the top of my head. And one thing you can learn from all of these great leaders, whether it's Jesse Jackson or Dr. King or Diane Nash, is, sometimes they know when to fight really aggressively, and then sometimes they know when there's a moment to compromise or negotiate. And in that particular case, the accreditation board threatened to remove the accreditation from North Carolina A&T because it was becoming a hotbed of activism. And that was a very frightening threat. Our degrees won't mean anything. So there was this meeting at a black church near campus, and the activist pretty much allowed Jackson to decide what they were going to do. Are we going to surrender in order to protect our accreditation, or are we going to risk it all and continue to fight? And Jackson's always had a penchant for rhyming, and he closed his fiery remarks in that church with the words, demonstration without hesitation. And they marched back to the jailhouse to continue protesting. And it was a bluff on the accreditation board's part. They didn't remove the accreditation from the university. But that was another one of those crucial first moments in his lifelong commitment to activism and advocacy.
So why does he become a Democrat if all these Democrats are giving him such grief and trying to remove control over universities that he's going to?
Jackson once said that he used the word perhaps. He said, perhaps we would have been better off if during the Great Depression we had started, and he was using we rhetorically, editorially, but he said if we had started a labor party and could really advocate for labor and the working class outside of the Democratic Party. But for better and for worse, we live in a duopoly, and that often leaves us with a binary choice. So because of the civil rights leadership because of the New Deal, which even though it excluded blacks from many of its programs, brought a lot of black voters into the party, and because of the leadership of the Kennedy brothers and Lyndon Johnson, the Democratic Party became the party aligned with, at that time, civil rights. Maybe not to the extent that they had hoped, and certainly not every Democrat, maybe not even the majority of Democrats, but it appeared to present an opportunity. And once, when providing a political analysis, Jackson said that sometimes the most important factor isn't the ship on the water, but it's the movement of the ocean. So if one within the Democratic Party and agitating outside of the Democratic Party can create enough movement to allow that ship to drift in a more favorable direction, then one should certainly do it. So that was their philosophy at the time.
So as we move here toward the end of our podcast, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about Jesse Jackson today, and then I would like to end with us talking about his relationship with Martin Luther King Jr., particularly on the last days of King's life. But if you can tell us a little bit about, so you have interviewed Reverend Jackson fairly recently.
Yes. Yeah, just a couple of months ago, I conducted an interview with him, and a transcript of it is available on the Washington Monthly's website. So Jackson is 81 years old, and he has Parkinson's disease. And if anyone has any familiarity with Parkinson's, they know it's a terribly debilitating condition. And he was diagnosed several years ago, and even though it has, significantly restricted his mobility and taken away some of his force and his energy, he's still very much committed to the work. He's in his Chicago office, 6 or 7 days a week, and because he doesn't travel nearly as much as he once did, and he doesn't have nearly as many speaking engagements, he's much more involved at the local level. For example,
So in some ways, that's a return to the beginning.
yeah. So, for example, he was very much involved before the 2020 election in convincing the mayor, Lori Lightfoot, and others to install more polling places in jails, because Illinois is one of these states with a law in the books that felons can't vote. And that's something that needs to change. But many people in jail haven't been convicted of anything. So he did that. He just made his annual visit every Christmas. He speaks at the Cook County Jail. His son, Jonathan Jackson, was recently elected to Congress, a district representing the south side of Chicago. So he was certainly very much involved with that campaign. And his organization, Rainbow Push, has a wonderful staff, and they do things like every Thanksgiving they have a pretty big meal and spread for anyone who wants to come, but it's typically low-income families who take advantage of that opportunity. They have a tech center in the basement where children and young adults can use computers and learn things like programming at no cost. So it's a great philanthropic organization as well, and that's where he's devoting much of his attention these days.
I'm thinking that we have had the opportunity to see Reverend Jackson grow old. Mm-hmm. And we can see the lines creeping into his face, and we can see his hair changing a little bit. Obviously, we didn't get that chance with Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and Reverend Jackson was with King in the last days of King's life, and Jackson was involved in the Poor People's Campaign. Mm-hmm. I wonder if you could take us back to April 1968.
Yeah, definitely. And it's important to remember that, King has almost become a secular saint in our society. And, he's certainly a hero, but people have forgotten how despised he was at the end of his life. The FBI called him the most dangerous man in America. And Jackson has talked about during those days how even many black organizations and black churches and black campuses had turned against him because they didn't like that he was so outspoken in opposition to the Vietnam War. They were saying that their objection wasn't moral, it was tactical, that, you're potentially costing us an ally in Lyndon Johnson, so you should be quiet about the war. But Jackson told me that King said, I won't bifurcate my sense of justice. And out comes that very famous King aphorism, an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So I already spoke about the last birthday. They went to Memphis, King and his aides, Jackson, Andrew Young, and others, to advocate for sanitation workers who are on strike, for better pay, better benefits, better working conditions. And Jackson was actually speaking to King when King was standing on the balcony at the Lorraine Motel, and they were supposed to go to dinner, and Jackson wasn't wearing a dress shirt and tie. He was wearing a sweater. And King shouted down to Jackson, why aren't you wearing a shirt and tie? We're about to go to dinner. And Jackson joked back, the prerequisite for going to dinner is an appetite, not a necktie. And King laughed, and then they heard the shot, and it struck King, and Jackson saw it happen, and he rushed up, and he, along with some of the other aides, witnessed King's final breaths. And there's an amazing, sad but amazing moment captured that evening. Jackson's on a Memphis television station, and he said, we don't know yet who pulled the trigger, but the pathologies and the neuroses of Memphis, of Tennessee, and of America is what ultimately killed Dr. King. So those were the last days, and King was attempting to build a poor people's movement, and it started with that last birthday. And then there was a poor people's movement at the Capitol, the Washington Mall. It was an attempt to replicate the 1963 March for Jobs and Justice, where King gave the I Have a Dream speech, but on behalf of the poor of all races, of all religions, multiracial and ecumenical. But it floundered. The assassination of King had really taken the wind out of the sails of that effort, and they were all depressed at the end. And Jackson had been elected mayor of Resurrection City. That's what they called the gathering of people there at the Washington Monument. And as the mayor, quote unquote, of Resurrection City, they asked him to say some final words. And he thought, what can I tell all of these, committed activists who are feeling such disappointment right now, because we didn't draw that many people. We didn't draw any attention. We're certainly not going to change any public policy as a result of this. So what can I tell them? And he remembered an old poem that he once heard a minister recite as an affirmational call and response with a congregation. And he asked the audience to repeat after him. And it was, I may be black, but I am somebody. I may be poor, but I am somebody. I may be disabled, but I am somebody. And you'd say I am somebody. Say I am somebody. And you got this crowd to keep repeating, I am somebody. And that, of course, has become the signature line. Jackson, I think, has opened every speech for the past 30 or 40 years with those words. And that's why I used it as the title of my book, I Am Somebody, Why Jesse Jackson Matters. And Dr. King, of course, coined a great term, somebodyness, that every human being possesses an inherent dignity that he called somebodyness. And even in the midst of oppressive political policies or cultural bigotry, there's an undeniable somebodyness. So the call and response affirmation of I am somebody on a political and psychological level is an advancement of an articulation of that King concept.
Well, great. Thank you, Professor
Thank you.
Masciotra, for giving us a sense of somebodyness here for a couple of minutes as we sit in Columbia, South Carolina. As a reminder, the book is I Am Somebody, Why Jesse Jackson Matters. And I am Ken Germany of the Department of History, and this is the Institute for Southern Studies.